Today's first reading comes from the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus is teaching his disciples about prayer, and he says to them, "Whenever you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and at the street corners, so that they may be seen by others. Truly I tell you, they have received their reward. But wherever you pray, go into your room, shut the door, and pray to your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. When you are praying, do not heap up empty phrases as the Gentiles do, for they think that they will be heard because of their many words. Do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask him." Our second reading comes from Paul's letter to the Romans. The Apostle Paul writes, "Likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness, for we do not know how to pray as we ought. But that very Spirit intercedes for us with sighs too deep for words. And God, who searches the heart, knows what is the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for the saints according to God." The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Peter Marty is the editor of the Christian Century magazine, and I'm drawn to a proposal he made a few months back. He recommends that we alter the way we talk about prayer by eliminating the use of the word answer. I like it. It shifts our notion of prayer away from the idea that prayer is similar to putting up our Amazon wish list. Far too many of us have a childlike understanding of prayer as praying to God for what we want. Then, if we receive what we prayed for, which can run the gamut from a parking place to being cured of cancer, we assume God answered our prayer. If we do not receive what we desired, then we conclude that, well, we just didn't pray hard enough, or there weren't enough people praying, or I'm supposed to be taught patience, or the answer was no, or God was in Aruba not taking calls. Another reason to drop the word answer from talk about prayer is, I think, the sheer arrogance of it. Do we really think that God does not know what we need until we put it into words? Another difficulty with connecting the word answer with prayer is that our self-interest skews our perspective. A Presbyterian minister named Harry Kazinga remembers a time back in his seminary days. There was this especially devout group of students who gathered every morning for what they called morning watch. This was a daily period of prayerful silence in which they listened for God's Spirit to direct their priorities. Sounds good, and I wish I had such a discipline. He says that as a semester was ending, 3 of the students approached one of their professors and said that at morning watch, God had instructed them not to take his final exam. Some of you felt that spirit back in college too, I think. The professor spelled out in no uncertain terms that it was not God's voice they had heard, but something emanating from a much lower source. Well, today we heard 2 different passages focused on prayer. The first was advice from Jesus on how not to pray. He said, whenever you pray, do not be like the hypocrites. They love to stand up in the synagogue or go to the street corner so that everybody can be impressed with their words. Do you know people who post too much about themselves on their Facebook page? That's the idea. Prayer should never be a spectacle designed to impress others. Prayer is supposed to be an honest and authentic conversation with God. The second passage comes from the Apostle Paul, who speaks for many of us, I think, when he says, "We do not know how to pray." Sometimes prayer is simply sighs too deep for words. Do you know that prayer? Whenever prayer is a struggle, which is much of the time for me, or whenever someone infers that prayer is something simple, I fall back on this wisdom of Paul. We do not really know how to pray. Now, Paul was a devout Jew. He prayed daily, oftentimes during the day. But he was wise enough to approach conversations with God with humility. He knew that anyone who thought prayer was a smooth and uncomplicated matter failed to grasp its depths. Numerous theologians have written lengthy books on prayer. What is it? Why do we do it? How do we do it? Does it do any good? What difference does it make? Questions have been swirling around the topic of prayer for eons. Thankfully, Jesus taught all of his followers a prayer, the Lord's Prayer. And we're going to focus on that next Sunday. As I wrestled with this subject of prayers over the past couple of weeks, some ideas seemed to step forward for me while others retreated. My hope is that beyond today's service, you will continue to ponder at least one of these. First, prayer is a time to be fully present with God in order to build a more intimate relationship. Presence and relationship. God's not peering down from some distant galaxy. God is throughout the cosmos and as near to us as our breath. Although it often feels like God is absent, I think it is actually we who are absent. We live such scattered lives. We speak of being scatterbrained. The truth of the matter is that the scatteredness is much more systemic. We are scattered at every level: body, mind, soul. We throw ourselves into the past, often clinging to some past pain or trauma. Or we hurl ourselves into the future, attaching ourselves to a hope or a fear. We're in the past, we're in the future, we are everywhere except here. To have presence of heart is a remedy. It's an unscattering. Presence is simply to have your heart where your feet are. Not that that's easy. Our minds love to stray, don't they? 1,000 different thoughts are vying for our attention all the time, and we have to keep eliminating them. Delete, delete, delete. Keep in mind that praying is not all cerebral. Some find that they're able to maintain a much better focus if they just concentrate on breathing or walk a labyrinth or handle prayer beads or sing words. or focus on the flame of a candle, or look at a piece of art. When we're present with God, we engage in a conversation. We generate thoughts in our minds. And then the hard part, we listen for the whispers in our souls. Prayer is not about telling God what to do, but about focusing our awareness on God's presence. Hopefully, that will naturally lead to gratitude. 90% of our prayers ought to be prayers of thanks. 10% can be lament and protest. But the overwhelming majority of our prayers ought to begin by just recounting the many blessings of our lives. Daily prayers of thanksgiving remind us of the numerous graces we enjoy. Such prayers expand and intensify our gratitude, which actually alters the way we perceive reality and paves the way to a purposeful life. Even in the throes of dark times, we can name something for which we're thankful. Another thought. Prayer can help us tap into a reservoir of strength. The more persistently we hang in there with prayer, the more we encounter a God who does not provide an answer to our every need, but who offers strength for our every need. How this happens, I can't say, but I've experienced it, and I have witnessed it in others. I've been at the edge of being just overwhelmed and drawn strength in order to endure. Likewise, I've known people who have suffered a horrific loss, a loss that could have destroyed them. But they tapped into a source of strength that allowed them to survive. However, this comes with a warning. Such strength is not garnered quickly. It's built up over time. If you have failed to nurture a spiritual life, you cannot suddenly dip your cup into this reservoir of strength and expect to draw out much. However, if you've lived an active spiritual life, you will find the strength when you need it. Prayer can also give us a new set of eyes. It can help us see the world from God's perspective. I think this insight into prayer has probably helped me more than any other. God does not see people according to races or nationalities or any of the other labels that we fearful, finite creatures like to slap on people. God sees beloved children. And when we attempt to view others as God does, we don't see enemies, we don't see adversaries, we see brothers and sisters. People who can enrich our lives, and people whose lives we can enrich. When we squint to view the world from God's perspective, we not only see the world as it is, but we also see it how it can be. It urges us to be kind, forgiving, passionate about justice, generous. It inspires us to work for the world that God dreams it can be. And finally, prayer can help us discern and echo in our soul that everything's going to be all right. When we lived in Richmond, Camilla worked at Virginia Commonwealth University, and there was a woman in her office who developed breast cancer. Donna was a 30-something single mother who had this bright, cheery 8-year-old daughter. Donna underwent surgery, radiation, chemotherapy, but nothing would stop that odious disease from stealing her life. In her final week, Camilla and I visited Donna in the hospital. There were 20 people crammed into her small room. She was drifting in and out of consciousness. It was apparent at that moment that we were no longer talking weeks or even days, only hours. The medical team was doing all it could to make her comfortable. Turns out there were 2 other pastors in this crowd, and at one point, one of them asked everyone except the pastors to clear out. As he saw it, it was time for the professional prayers to step in. I cringed at the thought, and I felt trapped. Once everybody was out in the hall, the 3 of us formed a circle around Donna. A couple of us were holding her hand. One pastor began to pray, and he called on God to perform a miraculous healing right there on the spot. When he finished, the other picked up where he had left off, except louder and a more intensive tone, which I found very disturbing. If our notion of God is that God could have healed her but was waiting for us to ask, is that the kind of God we believe in? I can't imagine God is waiting for us to bark commands before acting, or refusing to respond until a sufficient number of requests have been registered. I understand that when times are bleak and people are desperate, some imagine that God will do for them exactly what they wish. But how absurd to think that we could exert such control over our Creator. Well, after the first 2 finished, it was my turn. Feeling wholly inadequate, but aware that some people can hear even though they're unconscious. I gave thanks for the beautiful way she had lived her life, and for the generous way she had touched others. I expressed gratitude for the wonderful job she had done raising her daughter. I prayed that she would feel this enormous outpouring of love of her family and her many friends. I prayed that she would be reassured deep in her soul that her daughter was going to be well cared for, and that her daughter would never forget her. And finally, I prayed that Donna would know God's presence and feel in every fiber of her being that there was nothing, not this odious disease, there was nothing in this life or the next that would separate her from God's love. Prayer can reassure us that we are eternally embraced by God. A colleague remembers Anna, a parishioner in his congregation who was terminally ill. Sometimes when he visited her in the hospital, she would pray. Other times he would take the lead. Even though Anna's voice and body weakened as the weeks passed, Her eyes always had a little sparkle to them, and her mind remained sharp. And then one day when he showed up, she said, "Pastor, I'm not getting any better. How about we skip the prayers for healing today? I just want you to pray for the Lord not to leave me. That's all I want now. The close company of God." And isn't that what all of us need? In good times, in times of struggle, and at the end of our journey, the reassurance of the close company of God. We nurture that awareness through a life of prayer.